His daughters hid behind him until the Apache woman knelt. Then they wouldn't let her go. But that was later. That was after the fear and the snow and the rifle he held balanced in the crook of his arm. If you want to understand how a man's world, broken clean in two, can be put back together by the most unlikely pair of hands, you have to see that moment for what it was. Not a beginning, but a hinge. A single, quiet point upon which everything that came after would turn. It was the moment a debt he thought he owed became a life he never knew he could have. Stay, and you'll see how. It all started with a promise made by a dead man, carried across 100 miles of unforgiving country by a woman with nothing left to lose. He was Elias Thorne, a man who had narrowed his life down to the work of his hands. She was a stranger whose name he did not yet know, and she had come to collect. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The real beginning was 9 months before, on a day so bright and cruel it felt like a personal insult from God. That was the day Elias's wife, Sarah, had died, bringing their second daughter, Rose, into the world. The doctor from the settlement, 20 miles distant, had arrived too late, and all he could do was shake his head and accept a cup of coffee Elias didn't remember making. He left a bill for $10 on the table for services not rendered, and Elias had used it that evening to light the stove. After that, the world shrank to the size of his claim. 160 acres under the shadow of the Three Sisters, 3 granite peaks that tore at the sky. It was good land, with a creek that ran year-round and enough timber to see him through a dozen winters. He and Sarah had chosen it together. They had built the cabin with their own hands, fitting the logs so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. Every corner of it held her ghost. The way she'd insisted the window over the sink be wide enough to frame the whole valley. The worn spot on the floor where she'd rocked their first daughter, Clara, to sleep. The small cross-stitched sampler hanging by the door. Home is the place love gathers. Now it just seemed to mock him. Grief did not make Elias Thorne hard. It made him careful. He had seen men broken by loss turn to whiskey or rage, letting their fields go to weed and their stock wander off. Elias did the opposite. His grief became a kind of relentless order. He mended fences that weren't yet broken. He split and stacked enough firewood for 3 winters, not 1. He rose before the sun and worked until the last light bled from the high peaks, falling into his cot, too tired to dream. He told himself it was simplification, not loneliness. He had 2 daughters to think of. Clara, who was 6 and had her mother's solemn eyes, and the baby Rose, whose first months were a blur of exhaustion and quiet panic. Clara had grown quiet, a little shadow who followed him from the barn to the creek, her small face pinched with a worry no child should carry. She had taken on the role of mother to her baby sister with a gravity that broke Elias's heart. He'd find her humming the same lullabies Sarah had sung, her small voice a thin, wavering echo in the too quiet cabin. He was a good father in the practical sense. He kept them fed and warm and safe. But the softness, the comfort, the place they could run with a scraped knee or a hurt feeling, that had been Sarah. He was a wall, and they were 2 small vines trying to grow in its shadow. His only connection to the outside world was the monthly ride to the settlement of Harmony Creek for supplies. He'd tie his horse outside the mercantile, hand a list to Mr. Abernathy, and stand on the porch, deflecting the townsfolk's pity with curt nods. They meant well. The women offered to take the girls, just for a while. The men offered a drink. He refused it all. He didn't want their help. He just wanted to be left alone with his work. The work was honest. The work didn't ask him how he was feeling. There was one man he had called friend, an Apache scout named Dakota. They had worked a season together, guiding a survey team through the high country 2 years back. Dakota was a man who spoke little, but saw everything. He moved through the mountains like water, silent and sure. He taught Elias how to read the weather in the flight of a hawk, and how to find water where there was none. And he had saved Elias's life. A sudden rock slide, a shout, and a powerful shove that sent Elias sprawling into the clear while Dakota took the brunt of the falling scree. It had broken his leg and laid him up for a month. Elias had carried him back to his people's camp and stayed until he was healed, a debt between them that Dakota refused to acknowledge. "We were on the same rope," he'd said, and that was the end of it. Elias hadn't seen him since. He'd heard the government had moved the band south to a reservation a world away. Another loss. Another closed door. So his life was this: the rising sun, the work, the setting sun, the children. A closed loop of duty and memory. He had the land, the cabin, his daughters, and a silence that grew heavier with each passing week. He had fenced his life in, just like his pastures. He thought it was enough. He thought it would keep him safe. He had forgotten that the world and the past and the debts you think are settled can always find a way to your door. It happened on a Tuesday in late November. The sky had been the color of a fresh bruise all day, and by evening the first snow of the season began to fall. Not the gentle, promising flakes of early autumn, but a hard, wind-driven sleet that rattled against the windows and promised to bury the world. Elias had just finished banking the fire for the night. The girls were asleep in their shared bed in the loft, 2 small mounds under a pile of quilts. The cabin was warm and tight, a small ship in a sea of white. He stood by the window, watching the snow swirl in the lantern light, when he saw it. A shape, moving at the edge of the trees. It was slow, stumbling, too small for a bear, too deliberate for a deer. A person. Out here, in this, at this hour. His hand went to the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. It was an instinct as natural as breathing. In this country, a stranger at your door in a storm was either in desperate trouble or was trouble itself. He took the rifle down, the weight of the cold steel familiar in his hands. He checked the load. He moved to the door, his stockinged feet silent on the wood floor. He drew the bolt back with a soft, metallic click. He opened the door a crack. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from his hand, and in the shifting, blowing snow, he saw her. She was Apache. Her dark hair was matted with snow, her clothes thin and worn. She was holding herself, shivering so violently he could see it from 20 paces away. She took 2 more steps toward the porch light and collapsed, a small, dark heap in the fast, deepening snow. For a long moment, Elias did nothing. Every instinct for caution, for self-preservation, screamed at him to close the door, to bolt it, to wait for morning. This was not his trouble. He had enough trouble of his own. But then he saw the shape of her. She was slight and alone. And he thought of Sarah. He thought of his daughters asleep upstairs. What kind of man would he be if he let someone die on his doorstep? Grief had made him careful, not cruel. He laid the rifle on the table, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the storm.
The cold hit him like a fist.
He reached the woman and knelt. Her face was pale as ash, her lips blue, her eyes were closed. He thought she might already be gone. He slipped his hands under her arms. She weighed almost nothing. As he lifted her, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, bottomless, and for a second, lucid and sharp. Her lips moved, a sound lost in the wind. He leaned closer. "Dakota!" The name was a whisper, a ghost of a sound, but Elias heard it. And the world, which had been so small and simple a moment before, suddenly cracked wide open. He carried her inside, out of the storm, and laid her on the rug before the fire. He closed the door, shutting out the wind, and stood over her, the name echoing in the sudden, warm silence of the cabin. Dakota. A name from a life he thought he had left behind, a debt he thought was paid.
He looked at the unconscious woman on his floor,
And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the storm, that the past had just found his door, and he had let it in. He worked with a grim efficiency, his movements sure and practiced. He fetched a basin of cool water and a clean cloth, gently wiping the snow and grime from her face. Her features were fine-boned, her skin smooth despite the hardship etched around her eyes and mouth. She couldn't be much older than 20. He felt for a pulse at her neck. It was there, but faint and thready, like a moth beating against a window pane. Her hands were raw, her knuckles scraped and bleeding, as if she had been crawling. He noted the worn-out soles of her moccasins. She had come a long way. Too long. Upstairs, a board creaked. Clara. He looked up toward the loft, his heart tightening. He didn't want to frighten her.
he moved to the bottom of the ladder.
"It's all right, Clara, girl," he whispered. "Go back to sleep. Just a traveler caught in the storm." He heard a rustle, then silence. He hoped she believed him. The woman on the floor stirred, a low moan escaping her lips. Her eyes opened again, this time unfocused, clouded with fever. He saw it then, the flush on her cheeks, the unnatural brightness in her eyes. The cold had gotten into her. He knew the signs. If he didn't get her warm and soon, the storm outside would be the least of her worries. He built up the fire, the flames leaping up the chimney, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He hesitated for only a moment before he began to unlace her wet moccasins. Her feet were blocks of ice. He chafed them between his hands, the friction slowly bringing a flush of life back to the frozen skin. He did the same for her hands. Her dress was a thin, worn deerskin, soaked through. Leaving her in it was a death sentence.
He looked away.
Toward the fire, a muscle working in his jaw. He thought of Sarah, how she had nursed him through a fever one winter, her touch gentle and matter-of-fact. He grabbed the driest, warmest quilt from his own cot and a spare nightshirt of Sarah's he hadn't had the heart to throw away. With as much dignity as he could manage, he worked quickly, removing the wet outer garments and wrapping her tightly in the thick wool of the quilt, her small frame lost in its folds. He bundled the wet clothes and set them on the hearth to dry. He managed to get her to sip a little lukewarm water, but she was mostly delirious, muttering words in a language he didn't understand, punctuated by the name he did. Dakota. He pulled a chair to the hearth and sat, the rifle now resting against the wall. An hour passed, then 2. The storm howled, but inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the woman's shallow, ragged breathing. He watched her, this stranger who had fallen into his life, and wondered at the chain of events that had brought her here. Where had she come from? Where were her people? Dakota had spoken of a sister, a younger sister he was proud of, who was clever with her hands and had a fierce spirit. Was this her? He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, the fire had burned low, and the first pale, grey light of dawn was filtering through the window. The snow had stopped. The world outside was a blanket of pure, unbroken white. The woman was still asleep, but her breathing was deeper, more even. The feverish flush on her cheeks had subsided. He stood and stretched, his back aching from the chair. He added more logs to the fire, moving quietly so as not to wake her or the girls. He was pouring oats into a pot of water when he felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down. Clara stood beside him, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes wide and fixed on the figure by the fire. "Is she an angel, Papa?" she whispered. Elias's throat went tight. He knelt down to her level. "No, sweet girl. She's a person. She got lost in the snow." "Is she sick?" "A little. We're going to help her get well." He looked from his daughter's worried face to the sleeping woman. He had said, "we." The word felt strange on his tongue. For 9 months, it had just been him. Now, suddenly, there was a "we" that included a stranger. Rose woke then, her cry from the loft sharp and demanding. Elias went up and brought her down, her small, warm body a comfort in his arms. He settled her on his hip and began to stir the porridge. Clara, emboldened, crept a few feet closer to the hearth, peering at the woman. She had never seen an Apache up close. The people in town spoke of them in whispers, with fear or scorn. But this woman just looked small and tired. The woman chose that moment to wake. Her eyes opened, and this time they were clear. They swept the room, taking in the log walls, the stone fireplace, the man with a baby on his hip, the small girl staring at her. Her gaze was not fearful, but assessing. It was the look of a hunter evaluating new territory. Her eyes finally came to rest on Elias. They were dark and intelligent, and held a deep, weary sorrow. "You are the man with the scar," she said. Her voice was low and raspy, but the English was clear, accented, but precise. Elias unconsciously touched his left hand, where a pale, jagged line ran from his thumb to his wrist. A souvenir from the rock slide. "I am," he said. "My brother Dakota told me of you," she continued, pushing herself up on one elbow. The quilt slipped, revealing the collar of Sarah's nightshirt. She looked down at it, then back at him, a question in her eyes.
Your clothes were wet,
Elias said gruffly, turning his attention back to the porridge. "You would have frozen." She accepted this with a slight nod. She did not thank him. It was a statement of fact, not a rescue that required gratitude. He respected that. He dished out 3 bowls of porridge, the familiar morning ritual now feeling strange, observed. He set one bowl on the floor for Clara, put Rose in her high chair with a few spoonfuls, and then looked at the woman. He didn't know what to do. "You should eat," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. She watched him for a long moment, then slowly, painfully, sat up. She winced as she moved, her body stiff and sore. She took the bowl he offered, her fingers brushing his. Her hand was small, but her grip was firm. She ate slowly, deliberately, like someone who hadn't seen food in a long time, but knew better than to rush. Clara watched her, mesmerized. When she was finished, she set the empty bowl aside. "My brother is dead," she said. It was not a question. It was a stone dropped into the quiet room. Elias stopped his own eating. He looked at her, at the profound, exhausted grief in her face, and it was like looking in a mirror. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were inadequate, but they were all he had. "The soldiers came," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They moved us south, to the dry lands. There was a sickness. My mother, my father, gone. Dakota was already gone. He died on the journey." She recited the facts of her life's destruction as if reading a list. "Before he left, he told me. He said, 'If the world breaks, you go north, to the Three Sisters. You find the white man he guided, the one with the scar on his hand.' He said this man owed him a life." Elias felt the weight of that sentence settle on him. He owed him a life. Dakota had never said that. Dakota had said they were on the same rope. But this was how the story had been passed down. As a debt. A bill to be collected. "He said you were a man who understood debt," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "He said you would honor it." Elias looked at her. This ghost from his past. This living, breathing obligation. He looked at his daughters, one watching with wide, curious eyes, the other happily smearing porridge on her face. His life was already balanced on a knife's edge. Taking this woman in, it was a risk he couldn't calculate. The people in town would talk. It could bring trouble. And yet, he owed him a life. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I am Ishtar," she said. It meant "I" in her language. A watcher. It suited her. "I am Elias Thorne." "I know," she said. She pulled herself to her feet, swaying slightly. She was weak, but her spine was straight. "I do not ask for charity. I can work. My brother said you had a wife." She looked around the cabin, at the absence of a woman's touch, at the two small children, and she understood. "I see." There it was, the bargain laid bare. She was not asking for a handout, she was offering a solution to a problem he hadn't even let himself fully acknowledge. He was a man drowning in slow motion, and she was offering a raft. A raft that came with its own complications, its own dangers. "There is a second reason my brother sent me," Ishtar said, her voice dropping lower. She looked toward Clara, who was now hiding half behind her father's leg. "He said you had a good heart, but that grief had built a wall around it. He said a man cannot raise daughters alone in the wilderness, not properly. He said, you needed someone to mend the holes in your life as much as I needed a place to live." Elias stared at her. Dakota, the quiet scout, had seen him more clearly than anyone. He had seen the fault lines in Elias's carefully constructed life. He hadn't just sent his sister to collect a debt for himself, he had sent her to pay a debt for Elias. It was a gesture of friendship, so profound, so forward-looking, that it stunned him. He looked at Ishtar, standing there in his dead wife's nightshirt, proud and broken and fierce all at once. He looked at his children. He looked at the home he had built, a place that had become more of a tomb than a haven. And he thought of a refrain he hadn't considered in years, something his own father used to say while fixing tools on the farm. "A thing mended with care is stronger than what was never broken." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "There's a room," he said, gesturing to a small partition at the back of the cabin he had started for a storeroom but never finished. "It's not much, but it's dry and warm." Ishtar looked at the small, unfinished room. She looked at him. She looked at his daughters. Her gaze was long and searching. Then, for the first time, a flicker of something other than grief or exhaustion crossed her face. It was not relief. It was resolve. "It is enough," she said, and with that, the bargain was struck. The first week was a study in silence. Ishtar moved through the cabin and the surrounding homestead with a quietness that was almost unnerving. She was a ghost with purpose. She claimed the small back room, and with a few of her sparse belongings, a woven bag, a knife, a small bundle of dried herbs, she made it her own. Elias gave her a spare blanket and a pillow stuffed with corn husks. He did not cross the threshold of her room, and she did not venture into the loft where he and the girls slept. They were two planets in a shared orbit, held in place by a fragile gravity of necessity and unspoken grief. Elias watched her. He couldn't help it. He was a man who understood the world through work, and he judged others by the same metric. He expected her to be weak, to need time to recover. But her resilience was a quiet rebuke to his assumptions. On the second day, he found her outside by the woodpile, his spare axe in her hand. It was too big for her, the handle long and unwieldy. He started to go to her, to tell her to leave it, that it was his job. But he stopped. He watched from the barn door as she swung it. Her first few attempts were clumsy, the blade glancing off the log. But she adjusted her grip, changed her stance, her body learning the rhythm of the tool. By the 10th swing, the axe fell true, splitting the seasoned pine with a clean, satisfying crack. She did not work for long. Her strength was not yet fully returned, but she split a half-dozen logs and stacked them neatly before going back inside. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. But it was a statement. I am not a burden. The next day he came in from checking his trap lines to find her sitting on the porch, his best leather harness laid across her lap. It was the one that had snapped a month ago, a clean break in the main strap. He'd meant to fix it, but it required careful, patient stitching, and he had neither the time nor the temperament for it. He'd simply switched to his older, more worn harness. Now, Ishtar had it. In her hands were an awl from his toolbox and a length of sinew he didn't recognize. Her fingers moved with a deftness and economy that was mesmerizing. She wasn't just patching the leather, she was weaving the two broken ends together, her stitches small and tight and perfectly even. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice startling her. She looked up, her hands never ceasing their work. "My mother taught me. A good stitch holds longer than a new piece of leather." She held it up for him to inspect. The mend was a braid of sinew, thicker and stronger than the original strap. It was not just repaired, it was improved. He ran his thumb over the intricate stitching. It was a work of art, born of necessity. He grunted his approval. "It'll hold." It was as close to a compliment as he could manage. She just nodded and went back to her work. The girls were another matter. Rose, being a baby, was easy. She was warm and fed and held, and that was her whole world. But Clara was old enough to understand strangeness. For the first few days, she treated Ishtar like a piece of furniture that might suddenly bite. She would watch her from a distance, her eyes full of suspicion. If Ishtar came too close, Clara would scurry behind her father's legs, her small hands clutching his trousers. Ishtar, for her part, did not press. She seemed to understand the child's fear. She never spoke directly to Clara, but she would leave things for her to find. A perfect, smooth stone by the water pump, a hawk's feather on the porch step, a small doll woven from creek grass left on the table. Clara would eye these gifts warily, then, when she thought no one was watching, she would snatch them up and squirrel them away in her pocket. The turning point came on the 5th day. It was another cold, clear morning. Elias was in the barn, sharpening his tools. He heard a small cry of frustration from the cavern, and then the sound of something clattering to the floor. He walked back to see Clara standing in the middle of the room, tears welling in her eyes. She had been trying to braid her own hair, as she did every morning, but the tangles had won. Her hair, fine and blonde like Sarah's, was a hopeless snarl. The brush lay on the floor at her feet. Elias's heart sank. This was the part of fatherhood he was worst at, the small, tender things. His hands were too big, too clumsy. He would try to brush her hair, and she would yelp, and he would give up, his frustration mounting. "Clara, girl," he started, but he didn't know what to say. Ishtar had been sitting by the fire, scraping carrots for the evening stew. She put the knife and carrot down and rose. She moved toward Clara slowly, without a word. Clara tensed, ready to bolt. Elias held his breath. Ishtar did not reach for the brush. She did not try to touch Clara's head. Instead, she knelt. She knelt on the floor so that her eyes were level with the child's. She simply stayed there, quiet and patient, her hands resting on her own knees. She was not a threat. She was just there. Clara stared at her. The tears on her cheeks began to dry. She looked from Ishtar's calm face to her own tangled hair, then back again. After a full minute of silence, Ishtar held out her hand. Not to Clara, but toward the brush on the floor. It was a question, asked without words. Slowly, hesitantly, Clara bent down, picked up the brush, and placed it in Ishtar's outstretched hand. Ishtar took it. Then she turned and sat on the floor, her back to the hearth. She patted the space in front of her. It was an invitation. Clara looked at her father. Elias gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Go on." Clara took a tentative step, then another, until she was sitting on the floor in front of Ishtar, her back to the woman. Ishtar's hands were incredibly gentle. She began at the very ends of Clara's hair, working the tangles out with her fingers first, then with the tips of the brush. She worked slowly, patiently, without a single pull or snag. Elias watched, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He had never seen anyone take such care with something so small. Sarah had done it, of course, but he had never truly watched, never appreciated the quiet artistry of it. As Ishtar worked, she began to hum. It was a low, melodic tune, a song without words. It filled the silence in the cabin, weaving itself into the crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of the brush. Clara, who had been sitting as stiff as a board, began to relax. Her shoulders slumped, her head tilted to the side, leaning into the gentle rhythm of the brushing. Rose, in her high chair, stopped banging her spoon and listened, her head cocked. When all the tangles were gone, Ishtar's fingers began to move, weaving the blonde strands into a single, perfect braid, thick and smooth as a rope of silk. She had no ribbon to tie it off, so she used a small, thin strip of leather from her own bag. When she was done, she gave the end of the braid a gentle pat. Clara reached back and touched it. She turned her head, trying to see it. A small, wondering smile touched her lips. She looked over her shoulder at Ishtar, and for the first time, her eyes held not fear, but a dawning trust. From that day on, everything changed. Clara no longer hid. She began to follow Ishtar, a willing shadow now. She would sit beside her, watching her hands as she cooked or mended, asking quiet questions. "What is this? How do you do that?" Ishtar would answer in her low, calm voice, explaining the names of herbs, the way to stitch a seam, the stories her mother had told her. She was teaching the girl, Elias realized, not just skills, but a way of seeing the world, a way of paying attention. The evening shifted too. Before, after the girls were in bed, the silence between Elias and Ishtar had been a chasm. Now, it was becoming a space they could share. They would sit on opposite sides of the hearth, he cleaning a rifle or oiling a saddle, she weaving a small basket or sharpening her knife. The quiet was no longer empty. It was filled with the small sounds of their work, a companionable rhythm. One evening, about 2 weeks after she had arrived, she spoke into the silence. "Your wife," she said. "She planted the flowers by the door." Elias looked up, surprised. The climbing roses were dormant now, just thorny canes against the wall. But he had forgotten they were even there. "Yes," he said. "She loved them." "She had a good hand for growing things," Ishtar observed. "The soil is happy there." He didn't know how she could tell that from a bare patch of frozen earth, but he believed her. Her name was Sarah. It was the first time he had said his wife's name to her. Ishtar nodded slowly. "It is a good name." She looked into the fire. "Grief is a long winter," she said, as if stating a fact of nature, like the sun rising or the creek freezing. "But spring always comes." Elias looked at her, at the firelight catching the high planes of her face. He saw the echo of her own vast losses in her eyes. She wasn't offering him pity or empty comfort. She was offering him a truth she had earned, a truth they now shared. He felt a loosening in his chest, a knot he hadn't even known was there, beginning to untangle. He found himself talking, telling her about Sarah, about the way she laughed, about how she could see the shape of a homestead on a patch of wild land. The words came haltingly at first, then more easily, drawn out by Ishtar's quiet, patient listening. She did not interrupt. She just let him speak, her presence a steady anchor in the dark room. When he finally fell silent, the fire had burned down to embers. "She is not gone," Ishtar said softly. "She is in your daughters. She is in the walls of this house. You honor her by living, by being a father." He looked over at her. In the dim light, he saw that she had a scar on her right hand, a thin white line that mirrored the one on his own. He didn't know how she got it. He didn't ask. But seeing it there, a matched set, made him feel a strange sense of connection, as if they were two pieces of a broken whole that had somehow found each other. That night, as he lay in his cot, listening to the sound of his children's breathing from the loft and the faint, almost inaudible rustle of Ishtar moving in her small room, he realized the silence of the cabin was gone. It had been replaced by something else, the quiet hum of a life being lived, a life being mended. He did not yet have a name for the feeling that was growing in him. It was not love. It was not even affection. It was something more fundamental. It was recognition. He saw in her the same resilience, the same quiet dignity, the same refusal to be broken that he aspired to in himself. And he was beginning to understand what Dakota had known all along. Things that go together belong together. And against all odds, in this small cabin, under the shadow of the three sisters, they were beginning to fit. The rhythm of their life settled into the deep groove of winter. Time was measured in cords of wood, sacks of flour, and the slow, inexorable creep of the snowdrifts against the cabin walls. Elias ran his trap lines, hunted, and kept the animals fed. Ishtar took over the running of the house with a quiet competence that left him in awe. She stretched their supplies with a skill that bordered on magic, turning tough cuts of venison into savory stews, using every part of the animal. She made a warm, nourishing broth from bones he would have thrown to the dog. She showed him how to find the starchy cattail roots buried under the ice of the creek, and how to grind them into a serviceable flour. His larder, which he had thought barely adequate, now seemed abundant. She was a healer, too. When Rose developed a hacking cough that rattled in her small chest, Elias felt the old panic rise in him. He thought of the doctor, 20 miles of snow-choked trail away. But Ishtar was calm.
She went out with a basket
And came back with strips of willow bark and a handful of pine needles. She brewed a bitter-smelling tea and coaxed Rose to drink it, then made a salve of pine resin and beeswax and rubbed it on the baby's chest. Within 2 days, the cough was gone. Elias watched, humbled. He had built this home to protect his family, but he was beginning to realize that the true fortress was not the log walls, but the knowledge and skill this woman carried inside her. Clara was her constant apprentice. The girl's hands, which had been idle and fidgety, were now always busy. Ishtar taught her to weave small, tight baskets from willow shoots, to sew a straight seam with a bone needle, to recognize the tracks of a snowshoe hare. She taught her words in her own language, soft, musical sounds that Clara would repeat in a whisper, hoarding them like treasures. One afternoon, Elias came into the cabin to find the two of them at the table, their heads bent together. Ishtar was showing Clara how to draw with a piece of charcoal on birch bark. She was drawing the three sisters, her strokes spare and elegant, capturing their jagged essence. And beside her, Clara was drawing a picture of their cabin, with 4 figures standing out front. A tall man, a woman with dark hair, a small girl, and a baby. A family. The drawing hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. He saw his life through his daughter's eyes. He saw what she wanted, what she was already building in her mind. The intimacy between them grew not in grand declarations, but in small, incremental steps. It was in the way she began to fill his coffee cup in the morning before he asked. It was in the way he started leaving the best-grained pieces of wood by the hearth, knowing she liked to carve small figures in the evenings. It was in a shared, fleeting smile when Rose took her first wobbly steps across the floor, toddling from his knee to Ishtar's outstretched hands. One evening, as they sat in their accustomed silence, he was cleaning his rifle, and she was mending one of Clara's dresses. "You miss the music," she said, not looking up from her work. Elias stopped, the oiling rag still in his hand. "What music?" "Your wife's," she said. "There is a fiddle case in the loft. It is covered in dust." He was stunned that she knew. He had packed Sarah's fiddle away the day after she died. He couldn't bear to look at it. "I don't play," he said, his voice clipped. "But she did," Ishtar stated. "Clara told me. She said her mother used to make the cabin dance." Elias swallowed. She did. He could hear it now, the lively, joyful sound of a reel filling the small space, Sarah's foot tapping, her face flushed with happiness. The memory was so sharp, it was a fresh wound. "A house without music is a sad house," Ishtar said simply. She set aside her sewing. "My people have songs for grieving, and songs for celebrating, songs for planting and for harvest. The songs help the heart remember how to beat." She began to hum again, that same low, wordless melody she had hummed while brushing Clara's hair. It was a song that held a deep and ancient sorrow, but also a thread of unbreakable strength. He didn't get the fiddle down that night, or the next. But a week later, he climbed into the loft, brushed the dust from the worn leather case, and brought it down. He set it on the table. He didn't open it. He just left it there. A silent acknowledgement. An invitation. The outside world intruded in the 3rd month of Ishtar's stay. It came in the form of Mr. Abernathy, the mercantile owner who made the treacherous journey out to the homestead on snowshoes. It was the first visitor they'd had all winter, and his arrival felt like a breach. Elias greeted him on the porch, a knot of apprehension tightening in his gut.
Abernathy was a good man.
But he wasn't one for social calls, especially not in this weather. "Elias," Abernathy said, stamping the snow from his boots. He was a portly man, and the trek had left him winded. He glanced past Elias into the cabin, saw Ishtar moving by the fire, and his eyes widened for a fraction of a second before he composed his features. "Got some news for you. Not good news, I'm afraid." Elias led him inside. Ishtar gave Abernathy a polite, neutral nod and then discreetly moved to the back of the cabin, giving the men their privacy. Elias poured him a cup of coffee. "It's Silas Barrows," Abernathy said, getting straight to the point. "The land agent for the railroad." Elias knew the name. Barrows was a man with a reputation for getting what he wanted. He had a slick smile, a web of connections back east, and a complete lack of scruples.
"He's been in town for a week,"
Abernathy continued, warming his hands on the mug. "Asking questions. About you. About me? About this claim. He was in the county clerk's office pulling your file. He was talking with the sheriff. Something about a survey error. He's telling people the railroad's original grant from '72 actually includes this whole section, right up to the creek." Elias felt a cold dread seep into him. "That's a lie. My claim is legal. Filed and approved 5 years ago. I have the papers." "I know that, Elias. You know that. But Barrows is a snake. He'll find a loophole, or invent one. He'll tie you up in court until you're broke, or he'll just show up with hired men and run you off. He's done it before over in the next county." Abernathy leaned forward,
his voice dropping.
"And he's been making a point of telling folks you're out here all alone. A widower with 2 little girls. He's painting a picture. A man who can't possibly work a full claim. A man who'd be easy to persuade to sell cheap and move on." Elias's hand tightened into a fist on the table. It was the vulnerability he hated, the one he had tried to armor himself against with work and solitude. Barrows saw him as weak, a target. "I'm not selling," Elias said, his voice hard as iron. "I didn't think you would be," Abernathy said, "but you need to be ready, Elias. He's not the kind of man who gives a warning. He just shows up." He stood to leave. "I just thought you should know who was circling." After Abernathy left, a heavy silence descended on the cabin. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name and a face. Elias stood at the window, staring out at the land. His land. Every tree, every rock, every foot of soil, bought with his and Sarah's sweat. The thought of a man like Barrows laying a greasy hand on it made him sick with rage. Ishtar came and stood beside him. She had heard everything. "This man Barrows," she said, "he thinks you are alone." "He's wrong," Elias said, more to himself than to her. "Yes," she said, "he is." She looked out the window with him, her gaze fixed on the same horizon. "My people have a saying. The lone wolf dies in a hard winter. The pack survives." He looked at her then. She wasn't afraid. He could see it in the set of her jaw, in the clear, steady light in her eyes. She had faced the destruction of her entire world, had faced starvation and the wilderness alone. A slick land agent with a piece of paper was not going to intimidate her. In that moment, her strength flowed into him, shoring up his own. He was not a lone wolf, not anymore. "Let him come," Elias said, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt the cold, hard certainty of a righteous fight. He wasn't just defending a piece of land anymore, he was defending a home. He was defending his pack. They didn't have to wait long. A week later, on a morning when the sun on the snow was blindingly bright, they came. 4 of them, on horseback, picking their way up the trail to the cabin. Elias saw them from the barn. He recognized the stout figure of the town sheriff, Bart Johnson, and the taller, well-dressed man on the fine-looking bay must be Barrows. The other 2 were rough-looking men, the kind who hire their guns out for day wages. Elias walked calmly back to the cabin. Ishtar was at the door, watching them approach. Clara and Rose were inside. "Take the girls to your room," he said to her in a low voice, "and stay there." She met his eyes. There was no argument in her gaze, only a deep, shared understanding. She nodded, gathered Clara's hand, and lifted Rose onto her hip. As she turned, Elias saw her slip the long, heavy skinning knife from the kitchen block and tuck it into the waistband of her dress. She closed the door to her small room behind her, and Elias was alone in the main cabin. He took the rifle from its pegs over the fireplace. He didn't load it. Not yet. The presence of the sheriff meant this was, for now, a matter of paper, not powder. But he held it, the smooth, worn stock, a comfort in his hands. He stepped out onto the porch as the 4 riders reined in. He stood at the top of the 3 steps, the rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, its muzzle pointed at the ground. It was a position that was both non-threatening and ready. Silas Barrows swung down from his horse. He was a man in his 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that were too close together. He smiled a smile that didn't reach them. "Elias Thorne," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I am," Elias said.
Silas Barrows.
"Transcontinental Railroad. This is Sheriff Johnson." Barrows gestured to the sheriff, who had the good grace to look uncomfortable. Johnson gave Elias a curt, unhappy nod. He didn't dismount. "I have a legal matter to discuss with you, Mr. Thorne," Barrows continued, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "It seems there's been a significant error in the original survey of this area. According to our revised maps, authenticated by the Federal Land Office, this parcel falls within the railroad's priority grant." He held the paper out. "This is a notice of eviction. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Elias didn't move to take the paper.
He kept his eyes on Barrows.
"My claim was filed in 75. The title is clear. I have the deed, signed and sealed by the county." "An unfortunate mistake on the county's part," Barrows said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "One they'll have to rectify. The federal grant supersedes any local claim. It's a simple matter of law." "There's nothing simple about it," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is my home." "It's a house built on our land," Barrows countered, his smile tightening. "We're prepared to be reasonable, of course. We'll offer you $500 for the improvements you've made. The cabin, the fences. That's more than fair. It'll be enough to get you and your little ones set up somewhere else." $500. It was an insult. The land alone was worth 5 times that, and the cabin, built with his and Sarah's hands, was priceless. This was the game Abernathy had warned him about. The pretense of legality, the insulting offer, all designed to make him feel powerless. "The land is not for sale," Elias said, "and I'm not leaving. If you think you have a legal claim, you can file it with the circuit judge when he comes through in the spring. Until then, you're trespassing." Barrow's mask of civility slipped. A flicker of anger crossed his face. "Now see here, Thorne. I'm trying to do this the easy way, for the sake of your children. A man alone can't fight the railroad. It's a losing proposition. He took a step toward the porch. The cabin door opened. Ishtar stepped out. She stood beside Elias, a step behind him, her posture erect. She didn't have the knife in her hand, but he knew it was there. Her presence was a silent, powerful declaration. Her dark, unblinking eyes were fixed on Barrows. Barrows stopped dead. He stared at her, his composure completely gone. He looked from her to Elias and back again, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with insinuation. "It seems the widower isn't quite as alone as we thought. Found yourself some company?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably on his horse. One of the hired men snickered. Elias felt a white-hot rage rise in him, so pure and clean it burned away all fear. He took one step forward, shifting the rifle in his hands. It was a small movement, but it was enough. The hired man's snicker died in his throat. "This is my home," Elias repeated, his voice dropping to a low growl. "And this is my family. You will show respect, or you will leave. Now." Barrows looked at Elias's face, at the cold fury in his eyes. He looked at Ishtar, who had not flinched, her gaze like a physical force. He saw two people standing together, a united front. This was not the broken, isolated man he had been expecting to roll over. His calculation had been wrong. He held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "All right, Thorne. Have it your way. We'll play it by the book." He looked at the sheriff. "Your witness, Johnson. He's been served notice." He folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. 30 days. The law is the law. He swung back up onto his horse. "We'll be back, Thorne," he said, gathering his reins. "And we'll have a federal marshal with us next time. Think about your children. Think about what's best for them." He gave Ishtar one last, lingering look, then wheeled his horse around and led his men back down the trail. Elias stood and watched until they were out of sight. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the confrontation. He could feel Ishtar's presence beside him, a steady, grounding warmth. He slowly let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He had faced them down. They had stood together, and Barrows had retreated. But it was only a temporary victory. Barrows had said it himself. He would be back. And next time, he would have more than a compromised local sheriff with him. He would have the full weight of the law, or what passed for it, on his side. He turned and looked at Ishtar. "Thank you," he said. She simply nodded. "He thinks you are weak because you are one man," she said. "He does not understand." Elias looked back at the empty trail, then at the cabin, where he could hear his daughter's voices. He looked at the land, his land, and he looked at the woman standing beside him, who had faced down his enemies without a trace of fear. He was beginning to understand. Barrows saw a widower and 2 children. He saw a weakness to be exploited. He didn't see the truth. He didn't see the pack. But Elias knew that wasn't enough. A pack could be scattered. Barrows would use the law as a weapon, and in the eyes of that law, Ishtar had no standing here. She was just company, a complication that Barrows could twist and use against him. He needed an answer Barrows couldn't argue with. He needed a shield forged in the very system Barrows was trying to use against him. And as he stood there on the porch, the cold air on his face, the answer came to him. It was a desperate, crazy, and perfectly logical idea, an idea that would change everything. That night, The cabin was quieter than ever before. The confrontation had left a heavy stillness in its wake. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face and a deadline. 30 days. 29 now. Elias sat at the table, staring at the grain of the wood. He moved the salt cellar back and forth, his mind racing through options, each one a dead end. He could try to hire a lawyer in the territorial capital, but that cost money he didn't have and time he couldn't spare. He could try to appeal to the governor, but he was just one homesteader against the railroad. He felt trapped, the walls of the life he'd built closing in on him.
Ishtar was by the hearth.
Her hands busy with a piece of mending, but he could feel her watching him. She knew what he was thinking. She had been there for the threat. She was part of the equation now. Barrow's sneering dismissal of her, the way he'd looked at her, had ignited a protective instinct in Elias that was fierce and surprising. She was under his roof. She was his responsibility. But it was more than that. In that moment on the porch, standing together, they had been a unit, a force. He thought of Clara's drawing, the 4 figures, a family. He thought of what Dakota had told her. You needed someone to mend the holes in your life as much as I needed a place to live. Dakota had seen it. He had seen that their 2 broken lives, his and Ishtar's, could fit together to make a whole. A thing mended with care is stronger than what was never broken. The old words echoed in his mind, but now they had a new, urgent meaning. Mending wasn't just about patching what was torn. It was about creating something new and stronger at the point of the break. Barrow's leverage was that Elias was a lone man, a widower. In the eyes of the law, a single man with 2 babies was a precarious household, easily uprooted. But a family? A husband and a wife? That was the bedrock of a homestead claim. A married man was seen as stable, permanent. A family was an anchor Barrows couldn't so easily drag. The idea that had formed on the porch solidified in his mind. It was radical and terrifying. But it was also the only path he could see that led to safety, not just for his land, but for all of them, for Ishtar, for Clara, for Rose. He stopped moving the salt cellar. He looked over at her. The firelight played on her face, making her look like something carved from ancient, patient stone. He had to do this right. This could not be an order or a desperate plea. It had to be a choice, a partnership offered between equals. He had to make her understand that this wasn't about saving her. It was about saving them all, together. Ishtar, he said. His voice was hoarse. She looked up, her needle poised in mid-air. Elias. He took a breath. Barrows will be back. The paper he has is probably a bluff or a forgery, but the next one might not be. He'll use the law against me because the law sees me as being alone. He paused, searching for the right words. In their world, a man without a wife is considered temporary. She listened, her expression unreadable. She knew all this. He was just stating the facts of their predicament. He was wrong. On the porch, Elias continued, leaning forward, his hands flat on the table. When he said you were just company, he was wrong. You're not. You're essential. Here. He stumbled over the word, but it was the right one. She wasn't just helpful. She was vital. The heart of the house had started beating again when she arrived. I have an idea, he said, a way to fight him, a way that uses his own laws against him. He looked her directly in the eye, holding her gaze. We could get married. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and momentous. He rushed to explain, wanting to make the logic clear, to strip it of any misplaced sentiment. It would be a legal arrangement, a partnership. On paper, to the county, to the railroad, to Barrows, we would be a family. My claim would become our claim, a family's claim. They would have a much harder time breaking that. It would give you a legal right to be here, a protection that my word alone can't offer. It would protect the girls. It would protect this home. He stopped, letting the practicalities of it sink in. He wanted her to understand the strategy first. But then he had to say the rest. The part that wasn't about the law or about Barrows. The part that was about the truth. But that's not the only reason, he said, his voice dropping. He looked at his own scarred hand on the table, then at hers, resting in her lap. Dakota sent you here for 2 reasons. One for you, and one for me. I'm beginning to understand the second reason now. He looked up at her again. This place. It was just a house full of ghosts before you came. Just work and silence. You brought it back to life. You and me? We work well together. The girls. Clara loves you. He struggled, the words foreign to him. We fit. Here. Together. He had laid it all bare, the practical legal reason and the deeper, truer one. It was not a proposal of love or passion. He didn't have those words. It was a proposal of partnership, of mutual respect, of shared survival, that was perhaps in its own way something deeper than love. It was a choice. He waited for her to speak. The only sound was the hiss and pop of the logs in the fire. She looked at him for a long, long time. Her gaze was searching, weighing his words, his face, his heart. He felt utterly exposed, more vulnerable than he had been when facing Barrows's men. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was very soft. In my culture, she said, a marriage is a weaving of 2 lives. It is not a piece of paper. It is a promise to share a fire, to share work, to protect the children, to stand together against the winter. Yes, Elias said, his throat tight. That's what I'm asking. She looked toward the closed door of her room, where his daughters were sleeping. She looked around the cabin, at the life they had already started to build. Then her eyes came back to his. I will not take your wife's name, she said. It was not a defiance, it was a statement of her own identity. I am Ishta, daughter of Ketan Nai, sister of Dakota. I will keep my name. Relief washed over him, so potent it made him dizzy.
He hadn't even considered that.
Of course, he said quickly. You will keep your name, always. She gave a single, slow nod. Then yes, Elias Thorne, she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. I will weave my life with yours. The journey to the county seat at Harmony Creek was a declaration. They left the next morning. Elias hired a neighbor's boy he trusted, a strapping 17-year-old, to watch the girls in the homestead for 2 days, pressing a silver dollar into his hand. The boy's eyes went wide. It was more than a week's wages. Keep the fire hot and the rifle loaded, was all Elias said. He and Ishta rode side by side. He had saddled Sarah's mare, a gentle buckskin for her. She rode with a natural, easy grace that made the horse seem like an extension of her own body. They spoke little on the trail. The decision had been made, and there was a new kind of quiet between them. It was not the wary silence of strangers, nor the comfortable silence of companions. It was the charged, expectant silence of 2 people standing on the precipice of a shared future. Harmony Creek was a small, bustling town that served the scattered homesteads and mining camps in the region. As they rode down the main street, Elias was acutely aware of the stares they drew. Heads turned. Conversations on the boardwalk paused. He saw men at the saloons stop and watch. He saw women peer from behind the curtains of the dress shop. He met their gazes without wavering, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Ishtar looked straight ahead, her face a mask of calm dignity, as if she were the only person in the world who didn't notice the attention they were causing. Their destination was a small, clapboard building with a faded sign that read, County Clerk and Recorder. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale pipe smoke. A thin, balding man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from a massive ledger. This was Mr. Abernathy's cousin, Daniel, the neutral verifier Elias was counting on. "Elias," Daniel said, his surprise evident. "Didn't expect to see you in town before the spring thaw." His eyes flickered to Ishtar, standing just behind Elias's shoulder. "Daniel," Elias said, his voice steady, "we've come to file a marriage certificate." Daniel's eyebrows shot up to his hairline. He took off his spectacles and began to polish them with a corner of his vest, a nervous habit that bought him time to think. He knew Elias, he knew about Sarah, he knew the whole town's story. "A marriage certificate," he repeated slowly. He looked at Ishtar again, this time with a frank, searching gaze. She met it without blinking. "That's what I said," Elias affirmed. Daniel put his spectacles back on. He was a man of rules and records. His world was one of ink and paper, of official stamps and sealed documents. And what Elias was proposing was, for all its social strangeness, a matter of legal record. "All right," he said, his tone shifting to one of professional neutrality. He pulled a fresh form from a drawer and picked up a pen. "Name of the groom?" "Elias Thorne." "Name of the bride?" Elias hesitated for only a second. "Ishtar," he said, pronouncing it carefully. He did not give her father's or brother's name. That was for her. This was for the law. Daniel wrote it down, his pen scratching on the paper. "Last name?" "She will keep her own name," Elias said firmly. Daniel looked up, surprised again. This was highly unusual, but he checked the territorial statutes in his mind. There was no law against it. He simply made a note in the margin. He asked their ages, their places of birth. For Ishtar's, Elias just said, "This territory." Daniel accepted it. This was the frontier. Records were often incomplete. When the form was filled out, Daniel turned it around for them to sign. Elias signed his name with a firm, clear hand. Then he passed the pen to Ishtar. She took it, holding it awkwardly for a moment. He realized with a jolt that she might not know how to write in English. She looked at the line, then at him. He gave a slight, encouraging nod. She dipped the pen in the inkwell, and then, with slow, deliberate care, she did not sign a name. She drew a mark. It was a small, simple symbol of a single eye. Her name, Ishtar. It was more beautiful and more true than any signature. Daniel blotted the ink. "That'll be $2, he said. Elias paid him. Daniel took the certificate, and with a heavy, satisfying thud, he embossed it with the county seal. He made a copy for his own records and handed the official document to Elias. "It's done," Daniel said. "You're man and wife in the eyes of the territory of Colorado." He looked at Elias, then at Ishtar, and something in his expression softened. He was a clerk, but he was also a man who had known Elias for years. "Congratulations, Elias," he said, and it sounded like he meant it. "Ma'am," He gave a respectful nod to Ishtar. They stepped back out into the bright winter sunlight, the certificate safe in Elias's coat pocket. It was just a piece of paper, but it was also a shield. It was a wall. It was a declaration to Barrows and the world that this was a family, bound and legal. As they were about to mount their horses, Sheriff Johnson appeared, walking toward them from his office down the street. He stopped in front of them, his face grim. "Elias, I heard you were in town." "Sheriff," Elias said, his hand instinctively going to the pocket where the certificate lay.
"Barrows has been talking to a federal marshal over in Denver by telegraph," the sheriff said, lowering his voice. "He's planning on coming back out to your place at the end of the 30 days. He's not bluffing." "I know," Elias said. The sheriff looked from Elias to Ishtar, and he saw the way they stood together, the new and undeniable solidity between them. He looked tired. "I'm a lawman, Elias. I have to uphold the law. If he comes back with a federal warrant—" "He'll find things have changed, Sheriff," Elias said calmly. He pulled the certificate from his pocket and unfolded it. He held it up for Johnson to see. The sheriff leaned in, his eyes scanning the document. He saw the names. He saw the date. He saw the official seal of the county. He read it once, then twice. A slow whistle escaped his lips. He looked up at Elias, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He looked at Ishtar, who stood proud and still beside her husband. "Well, I'll be," the sheriff said,
a slow grin spreading across his face. "That is a game changer." He folded the paper and handed it back to Elias. "Barrows is building his case on the idea that you're a lone man on a big claim. A marriage, especially to a native of this land, that strengthens your claim in ways he won't be expecting. It shows permanence. It shows you're putting down deep roots." He tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, Elias. To both of you." He turned and walked away, his step seeming a little lighter. Elias and Ishtar mounted their horses. As they rode out of town, the stares that followed them were different now. The whispers were not just of scandal, but of something else. Surprise, grudging respect, the undeniable power of a bold move. Elias Thorne had not run. He had not folded. He had fortified his position. He had taken the woman who was the supposed evidence of his weakness and, with a single piece of paper, had transformed her into his greatest strength. They rode home, not as a man and his dependent, but as partners, husband and wife. A pack of two, heading back to their den to protect their young. The final confrontation came on the 30th day. The air was cold and still, the sky a sheet of pewter. Elias had been watching the trail since dawn. He didn't have to wait long. Just after the sun cleared the eastern ridge, they appeared. Barrows was there, on his fine bay horse, looking confident. Beside him rode a man with a silver star on his chest, the federal marshal. And behind them were the same two hired guns as before, their faces sullen. This time, they looked like they meant business. Ishtar sent the girls into her room with a quiet word, the same as before. Then she came and stood in the main cabin, her back to the fire, and waited. Elias met the riders on the porch again. This time, he left the rifle on its pegs. This was not a fight to be won with a gun. It was a battle of paper and will. The marshal, a tall, grim-faced man with a drooping moustache, dismounted along with Barrows. "Elias Thorne?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I am." "I'm U.S. Marshal Kane. I have a federal writ here, granting the Transcontinental Railroad temporary receivership of this parcel, pending a full hearing in the territorial court." He held out the document. It looked official. It looked final. Mr. Thorne has been given 30 days' notice to vacate, Barrows said smugly, stepping forward. That time is up. We're here to enforce the writ. Elias took the document from the marshal. He read it slowly. It was what he had feared. A legal document full of complex language that gave Barrows the power to evict him. But it was based on a single, flawed premise. "Marshal," Elias said, his voice calm and steady, "this writ is invalid. It is issued against Elias Thorne, a single man, holder of this claim." "That's you, isn't it?" Barrows said with a sneer. "It was," Elias said. He looked at the marshal, ignoring Barrows completely. "But the status of this claim has changed. It is no longer held by a single man. It is held by a family." He turned and pushed the cabin door open. "Marshal Kane, I'd like you to meet my wife." Ishtar was standing there, framed in the doorway. She was wearing a deerskin dress she had made herself, decorated with fine, intricate quill work at the collar and cuffs. Her black hair was in 2 long, neat braids. She looked like a queen in her own home. She met the marshal's gaze and gave a slow, dignified nod. The marshal stared, completely taken aback. Barrows's smug expression evaporated, replaced by disbelief and fury. "His what? That's absurd. This is a trick." "It's no trick, Mr. Barrows," Elias said. He reached into his coat and produced his own document.
The marriage certificate?
Crisp and official. "This was filed with the county clerk 2 weeks ago. It is a legal and binding marriage. My wife, Ishtar Thorne, is a co-holder of this claim." He deliberately used his own last name for her in this context for the benefit of the lawman. It was a shield, and he would use it. "This writ, issued against a single claimant, is null and void. You are attempting to evict the wrong party." Marshal Kane took the certificate. He was no fool. He was a career lawman, and he knew a legitimate document when he saw one. He scanned the names, the date, the embossed seal. He looked at Elias. He looked at Ishtar, standing proud and fearless in the doorway. He looked at Barrows, whose face was now a mottled red. The marshal understood the game. He had been brought here on a pretext to bully a lone man. But this was not a lone man. This was a family with a legally documented claim. To proceed with the eviction would be to overstep his authority and create a legal nightmare for himself and the railroad. He folded the certificate and handed it back to Elias. He turned to Barrows. "The situation is not as you described it, Mr. Barrows," he said, his voice cold. "The writ is improperly filed. I have no authority to remove a family from a claim held in their name. You'll have to take this up with the circuit judge." But he married an Indian," Barrows sputtered, his composure shattering. "That can't be legal." "There is no law in this territory that says a man can't marry who he pleases," the marshal said flatly. "And this document says they are married. As far as I'm concerned, that's the end of it." He turned back to Elias. "You'll likely see him in court in the spring, but until a judge says otherwise, you and your family are to remain here, unmolested. Do you understand, Mr. Barrows?" Barrows stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had been so certain of his victory. He had been checkmated by a piece of paper and a quiet, resilient woman. He glared at Elias with pure hatred, then spun on his heel, mounted his horse, and galloped away without another word, his hired men scrambling to follow. Marshal Kane watched them go. He tipped his hat to Elias, and then, with a separate, respectful nod, to Ishtar. "Good day to you, Mrs. Thorne," he said, and the name, spoken by an agent of the law, sealed their victory. He mounted up and rode off at a calm, deliberate pace. Elias stood on the porch,
the certificate still in his hand, and watched until the last rider was a speck in the distance. He had won. They had won. He turned and looked at Ishtar. She was still standing in the doorway, the quiet center of the storm. He saw in her eyes not triumph, but a deep, calm satisfaction. They had held the line. They had protected their home. He walked into the cabin and closed the door, shutting out the cold and the outside world. The door to Ishtar's room opened, and Clara and Rose came out. Clara ran to Ishtar and hugged her around the waist, burying her face in her dress. Ishtar put a hand on the girl's head, a gesture of profound tenderness. Elias walked over to the hearth and finally loaded the rifle and put it back on its pegs. The fight was over. Now, the rest of their lives could begin. The passing of the seasons brought a slow, deep change to the homestead. The defeat of Barrows was like the breaking of a fever. The tension that had held the cabin in its grip for months dissipated, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of a life being built. Spring arrived, painting the valley in shades of green. The climbing roses Sarah had planted by the door, which Ishtar had carefully pruned and tended through the winter, burst into a riot of crimson blossoms. Life was no longer a matter of grim survival. It was a collaboration. Elias ploughed the fields for a small crop of corn and potatoes, and this time Ishtar worked beside him, showing him how to read the soil, where to plant the squash and beans among the corn stalks in the way of her people, so the plants helped one another grow. He listened. He learned. His world, which had been one of brute force and labor, was becoming one of subtle connections, of paying attention. Ishtar brought the wildness of the land into their lives in a way he never could have alone. She taught the girls which berries were sweet, which roots were edible, which leaves made a soothing tea. Clara's pockets were always full of treasures: owl pellets, colorful stones, abandoned birds' nests. The girl's solemn, worried face had been replaced by one of bright curiosity. She moved with a new confidence, her bare feet tough and sure on the earth. The evenings were filled with a comfortable domesticity. Elias would read to Clara from the one book he owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare, his deep voice stumbling over the verse. And Ishtar, in turn, would tell them stories of her people, tales of Coyote the trickster and the Star people, her low voice weaving a magic that held the girls rapt. They were weaving their two worlds together, thread by thread. One night, Elias finally opened the fiddle case. His fingers were stiff and clumsy on the strings, but he scraped out a tune Sarah had loved, a simple waltz. The sound was rough, but it was music. Ishtar looked up from her mending, a small, rare smile on her lips. Clara clapped her hands. From that night on, music returned to the cabin. Their own language grew. He taught her to read and write English, her mind quick and sharp. She would practice by writing the names of things on a slate: table, chair, window, home. In return, she taught him words in her tongue, not just for things, but for ideas. She taught him the word for the way the light hits the peaks at sunset, a word that meant both beauty and sorrow. She taught him the word for the feeling of family, which translated not just to the people of my house, but the people my heart is tied to. One afternoon, while they were mending a fence line on the far side of the pasture, a loose strand of barbed wire snapped back, slicing both their hands as they worked to retighten it. It was a sharp, stinging pain. They went to the creek together to wash the blood away. Elias looked at the clean red cut on the palm of her right hand, then at the almost identical one on his own left palm. They mirrored each other.
2 new scars to match the 2 old ones. He took her hand and, with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt, he gently wrapped the wound. She did the same for him. They stood there for a moment, by the murmuring creek, their hands bandaged in matching cloth, the shared pain a strange and sudden intimacy. It was another knot tied, another stitch in the weaving of their lives. Barrows never came back. Abernathy told Elias on his next trip to town that the railroad had transferred him to a different territory, his failure here a black mark on his record. The land was theirs, truly and finally. The paper in the clerk's office was just an echo of the truth that now lived in the cabin. They were a family. That autumn, a year after she had arrived, Elias and Ishtar stood on the porch, watching the sun set. The air was crisp with the promise of coming cold. The girls were asleep inside. The cabin was warm and safe. He looked at the mended harness hanging from a peg on the wall, the one she had fixed when she first arrived. The braided sinew was dark with use, stronger than any other part of the strap. He thought of all the things that had been broken. His heart, her world, their family. And he thought of how, with patience and care, they had been put back together. A thing mended with care, he said softly, speaking the old words aloud, is stronger than what was never broken. Ishtar turned to him, the last light of the day catching in her dark eyes. She reached out and lightly touched the new scar on his hand with her own newly scarred hand. A mirror image, a matched pair. "It is good," she said. It was not an agreement, but a confirmation, a statement of a deep and abiding truth. He looked at her, at his wife, the woman who had come to his door as a debt and had become his partner, his strength, the center of his world. He finally understood the full depth of his friend Dakota's last gift. It was not just a safe harbor for a sister or a helping hand for a friend. It was the foresight of a man who knew that 2 halves, however jagged their edges, could make a whole. He remembered that first moment of terror and pity, seeing her fall in the snow. He remembered his daughters hiding behind him, afraid of the stranger. And he thought of that afternoon, when she had knelt on the floor, her patience and gentleness a bridge across their fear. It was that small act of kneeling, he realized, that was the first stitch, the first careful, patient movement that began the mending of them all. And his daughters, who now wouldn't let her out of their sight, were the living proof of it. The proof that a home is not just a place you build, but a life you choose to weave together, day after day.